October 12, 1986, a cold autumn rain soaked the dense timberline along Virginia's Colonial Parkway. Down a steep, overgrown embankment at the Cheatham Annex overlook, a white 1980 Honda Civic sat hidden in thick brush, shrouded by fog and damp foliage. Inside the small sedan, medical examiners discovered 21-year-old Kathleen Thomas and 21-year-old Rebecca Dowski. Their lives ended in the quiet darkness of a secluded lover's lane. The car had been manually pushed off the unpaved shoulder, plunging through dense briars before wedging against the tree line out of sight from passing motorists. Rainwater washed over the windshield, obscuring the interior where both young women remained side by side in the front seats. The tranquil riverfront scenery of the parkway had become the backdrop for an unprecedented nightmare that would linger for decades. The initial autopsy reports revealed a chilling level of violence applied with surgical control. Forensic pathology confirmed that both victims suffered severe strangulation leading to petechial hemorrhages before their tracheas were slashed. Furthermore, investigators found a rag soaked in diesel fuel stuffed into the fuel tank opening, alongside a diesel-soaked towel in the trunk, proving an unsuccessful attempt to cremate the vehicle and erase physical evidence. Despite the careful positioning of the bodies, forensic examination established no signs of forced entry on the Honda Civic, nor was there evidence of sexual assault. The perpetrator had gained immediate compliance from two strong individuals, including Kathleen Thomas, a trained United States Naval Academy graduate. The precise nature of the bindings and physical trauma indicated a killer who controlled the crime scene with calm, lethal efficiency. In those crucial early hours, law enforcement response splintered. The National Park Service and the Virginia State Police initially framed the double murder as an isolated act, suspecting a localized hate crime or a personal dispute due to the victims being in a romantic relationship. This early assumption blinded investigators to broader possibilities, preventing immediate coordination across municipal boundaries. By failing to lock down adjacent roads or cross-reference regional missing person reports, the initial investigative team lost vital momentum. Evidence at the periphery was trampled or overlooked during the chaotic first days. This foundational error allowed a calculating predator to step back into the shadows of coastal Virginia without leaving a recognizable footprint, leaving the surrounding communities in false comfort. Nearly 11 months passed before the silence was broken once again. On September 22, 1987, the focus shifted south of the James River Bridge along Route 17 to the Ragged Island Wildlife Management Area. There, another couple vanished without a trace, signaling that the nightmare at Cheatham Annex was not a single, isolated tragedy. The disappearance of 20-year-old David Knobling and 14-year-old Robin Edwards shifted the fear from a local tragedy to a systemic pattern. As family members searched the marshy riverbank, the dark reality became clear. Someone was actively hunting young people parked in remote, secluded pull-offs across the region, moving effortlessly between federal parkways and state wildlife zones. At the entrance to Ragged Island, searchers located Knobling's red Ford pickup truck parked near the shoreline. The truck's engine was off, but the windshield wiper switch remained engaged, and the driver's side window was rolled halfway down. Inside the quiet cab, the radio played softly, cash remained untouched in the glove box, and the driver's shoes sat neatly near the pedals. 3 days after the pickup was discovered, search parties found the bodies of Knobling and Edwards washed ashore along the tidal mudflats of the James River. Both had been shot execution style in the back of the head. The muddy water had swept away crucial biological material, leaving behind a stark, bleak crime scene stripped of obvious physical clues by the relentless tide. When crime analysts placed the files side by side, striking mechanical patterns emerged between the Honda Civic and the Ford pickup. In both cases, the driver's seats were pushed far back, adjusted for an operator over 6 feet tall, despite neither owner fitting that profile. The windshield wipers were switched on, the windows partially lowered, and personal valuables like cash and wallets were left untouched. This unique behavioral signature pointed directly to a calculated method of approach. The partial lowering of the driver window and the activated wipers mirrored standard traffic stop procedures, strongly indicating that the attacker used an authority persona or flashed emergency lights to force the vehicles to halt. The victims pulled over voluntarily, surrendering control to someone they believed was a police officer. Despite these glaring tactical similarities, jurisdictional friction severely paralyzed the investigative movement. The Colonial Parkway fell under federal jurisdiction, managed by the National Park Service and the FBI, while Ragged Island belonged to state land under the Isle of Wight County Sheriff's Department and the Virginia State Police. Each entity guarded its findings, creating administrative walls between key teams. Because evidence protocols differed radically across federal and state agencies, physical items were stored in separate facilities without a unified catalog. Fingerprint cards, hair fibers, and witness statements were rarely shared in real time. This division prevented crime scene technicians from connecting chemical evidence, such as the unusual diesel fuel signatures, across county lines. The cost of this institutional paralysis was devastatingly high. While law enforcement debated territorial boundaries, the serial offender refined their operating routine, learning the exact gaps between federal and state surveillance. Later cases, including the vanishing of young adults like Richard Call and Cassandra Haley during the broader 1986 to 1989 span, highlighted how dangerous these jurisdictional blind spots truly were. The failure to establish a single unified command structure between 1986 and 1989 allowed an active predator to freely navigate the Chesapeake Bay corridor. Unlinked files sat in filing cabinets while the killer remained steps ahead, exploiting the dark, unlit access roads of the region. A critical window to capture a serial killer was lost to bureaucratic delay and scattered records. To understand how these crimes occurred without immediate intervention, one must examine the geography of the Colonial Parkway itself. Stretching 23 miles between Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown, the unlit paved brick roadway offers no commercial streetlights or gas stations. Dense oak and pine forests swallow the road on both sides, shielding pull-off overlooks from public view. These isolated parking areas, situated on high embankments overlooking the York and James rivers, created perfect conditions for ambush. Drivers pulled into the dark turnouts with no cell phones or emergency call boxes available in that era. Once trapped at the edge of the water with trees blocking the rear, a vehicle had no escape route if another car pulled in behind it to block the lane. On the evening of October 9, 1986, 21-year-old Naval Academy graduate Kathleen Thomas and 21-year-old William and Mary student Rebecca Dowski were last seen leaving a campus computer lab around 1830. The couple drove toward the Cheatham Annex overlook along the Colonial Parkway, a quiet turnout popular among students seeking privacy. They parked their white Honda Civic near the edge of the embankment, completely unaware that they were being watched from the surrounding woods. When officers discovered the vehicle days later, pushed down a steep drop into the dense brush, it bore the clear markers of a calculated ambush. Both women had been bound, their throats cut, and their bodies placed in the rear of the car. Yet behind the brutal execution lay an immediate technical blunder that saved critical evidence from total destruction. The killer had doused the interior of the car and the trunk with diesel fuel, intending to burn the crime scene to ash and destroy all physical traces. Unlike gasoline, Diesel fuel has a high flash point and requires sustained heat or intense compression to ignite. When the killer dropped a lighted match onto the carpet, the flame flickered and starved out almost instantly in the cold, damp air. This fundamental chemical mistake preserved a wealth of trace evidence that would otherwise have been destroyed. The unburned fuel soaked deep into the upholstery, effectively sealing hair, fiber, and biological material beneath a protective layer of oil. State police forensic technicians were able to recover key trace samples directly from the seats, providing investigators with an intact biological record from the initial crime scene. Further analysis at the FBI laboratory focused on the ropes used to bind the victims' wrists behind their backs. Forensic examiners determined that the ligatures were secured with complex square knots tied under extreme, calculated tension. These were not random or panicked bindings, but specialized knots tied with mechanical precision. The lab analysis showed that the knot structure required specific training in maritime operations, heavy rigging, or law enforcement restraint tactics. The killer knew exactly how to immobilize two adult victims quickly without leaving room for a struggle. This distinct physical signature suggested a person deeply familiar with working lines on boats or handling professional restraints. For 7 months after the second double homicide at Ragged Island, the region remained on edge, waiting for another incident. Then, on April 9, 1988, another young couple vanished without a trace. 20-year-old Richard Call and 18-year-old Cassandra Haley left for their very first date, driving out into the quiet Virginia night. They never returned home, and their sudden disappearance immediately reactivated the deep fear gripping the region. The pattern was repeating, but this time the physical evidence left behind presented an even more baffling puzzle for local and federal investigators. At 07 Unco on the morning of April 10, 1988, a park ranger spotted Richard Call's red 1982 Toyota Celica abandoned at the Yorktown Overlook on the Colonial Parkway. The vehicle sat motionless against the scenic backdrop of the river, surrounded by absolute silence. The driver's side door stood wide open, exposing the empty cabin to the cold morning breeze. Inside the abandoned Celica, the driver's seat was pushed far back from the foot pedals, configured for someone much taller than Call. The ignition was turned off, and the car keys lay sitting directly on top of the dashboard. The scene looked less like a violent abduction and more like a routine traffic stop cut short. Forensic technicians processing the vehicle found Call's wallet, full of cash, sitting untouched inside the car. Cassandra Haley's purse was also recovered, along with both of their outer clothes, shoes, and socks, which were found folded neatly on the back seat. There were no visible signs of a physical struggle inside the cabin and no trace of blood residue on the upholstery. The neat placement of the garments strongly suggested the victims had been forced to disrobe under the threat of immediate violence or under the pretext of an official police command. The absence of forced entry or defensive marks on the dashboard reinforced the theory that an authority figure had approached the driver window before taking control of the vehicle. Intensive search operations immediately swept across the surrounding woods, riverbanks, and tidal marshes along the York River. Dive teams probed the deep waters, and bloodhounds tracked scents through dense underbrush, but searchers found 0 physical remains. With no bodies recovered, law enforcement faced an immediate procedural brick wall. The absence of physical remains prevented forensic pathologists from officially determining a cause of death or establishing a crime scene. As a result, the Virginia State Police initially classified Richard Call and Cassandra Haley as missing persons rather than homicide victims. This administrative delay severely limited the immediate allocation of federal homicide resources, By the spring of 1988, deep operational tension erupted between the FBI Behavioral Analysis Team in Quantico and state law enforcement leadership. Federal profilers argued that the staging of Call's Celica shared identical tactical signatures with the earlier double homicides, pointing to a single serial offender. They urged state police to treat all three cases as a connected series. Virginia State Police Command resisted this unified framework, reluctant to tie open missing persons cases to verified homicides without physical bodies as proof. This jurisdictional debate divided investigative focus, leaving reports filed in separate offices without a central command team reviewing the raw evidence across county lines. While agencies argued over case designations, real terror paralyzed the surrounding Hampton Roads community. Local colleges issued urgent safety warnings, instructing students never to park along secluded turnouts after dark. Couples who had once frequented the parkway now avoided the scenic route entirely, leaving the winding road deserted at night. Dark rumors spread rapidly across college campuses and residential neighborhoods about an unmarked police car patrolling the parkway. People whispered about a killer using blue emergency lights on their dashboard to pull couples over in the dark. The sense of safety along the coast was shattered, replaced by an unsettling realization that the road itself had become a trap. On September 5th, 1989, during the busy Labor Day weekend, a fourth couple vanished without a trace, escalating the terror along the Virginia coast. 21-year-old Daniel Lauer and 18-year-old Anna Maria Phelps were traveling together toward Virginia Beach, driving down Interstate 64 to spend time with family. They never arrived at their destination, prompting relatives to report them missing when calls to their destination went unanswered. Their abrupt disappearance pulled state investigators straight back into the nightmare that had haunted the region for 3 straight years. The vanishing of Lauer and Phelps matched the terrifying pattern of young couples vanishing off regional roads without leaving any clear sign of struggle. Investigators immediately recognized that the timeline and route placed this new vanishing directly within the geographic grip of the unknown predator. Police located Lauer's gold 1972 Chevrolet Hunter truck, abandoned at a highway rest stop near Toano, sitting quietly in the eastbound lane. The vehicle was facing away from their destination, resting in a public parking area where travelers constantly moved in and out. The truck doors were completely unlocked, and inside, the driver's side seat had been pushed unusually far back from the pedals. Forensic technicians examined the interior, noting that a roach clip remained untouched inside the open ashtray alongside personal belongings. The truck held no signs of violent entry, no broken glass, and no blood staining on the fabric seats. It was as if the occupants had simply stepped out into the humid late summer air and dissolved into the surrounding countryside. 6 weeks later, on October 19, 1989, local hunters moving through dense woods near Huntersville discovered skeletal remains, roughly 1 mile from the rest stop. The bodies of Phelps and Lauer lay hidden beneath a thick layer of autumn leaves and dense brush. A heavy green canvas hunting blanket had been drawn carefully over both sets of remains, concealing them from view from nearby walking paths. Forensic pathologists at the state crime lab performed a painstaking examination of the skeletal remains, searching for signs of fatal trauma. They identified distinct knife score marks across the surface of Phelps' ribs, proving that bladed force had been inflicted before her death. The advanced state of decomposition erased soft tissue evidence, but the bone marks confirmed that this double disappearance was an intentional double homicide. With the discovery near Huntersville, the terrible reality settled over law enforcement. 8 people had been murdered across 4 separate incidents between 1986 and 1989. 4 double homicides had occurred within a 30-mile radius, targeting young couples in isolated areas or near major travel corridors. The geographic overlap confirmed that a single, highly organized serial predator was operating across eastern Virginia without being caught. Institutional attempts to treat these crimes as random, unrelated local violence completely fell apart under the weight of 8 deaths. The expanding body count exposed a profound breakdown in regional security, proving that early failures to link the crime scenes had given a killer years of freedom. Community panic turned into deep public anger as families realized the killer had remained active while agencies argued over files. Profilers began dissecting the crucial distinction between the killer's operational methods and his underlying behavioral signature. Modus operandi naturally changed across the 4 cases, shifting from bladed weapons in the double homicide of Thomas and Dowski to firearms at Ragged Island, to missing bodies near Yorktown, and finally to skeletal bladed trauma in Toano. Modus operandi represents the tools and methods a criminal uses to commit a crime, and it frequently evolves as an offender gains experience or reacts to unexpected challenges. In contrast, an offender's signature represents the psychological need that remains constant regardless of changing circumstances. In every single crime scene, the killer demanded complete control over 2 victims simultaneously without allowing either to escape or signal for help. The recurring staging of the vehicles, the deliberate positioning of bodies or personal items, and the choice to attack in deep darkness formed a psychological pattern that linked all 4 cases together. Detectives focusing on the physical evidence identified a single glaring mechanical consistency. In all 4 vehicles, the driver's seat was pushed far back. Neither Daniel Lauer, Richard Call, nor the previous drivers required the seats to be positioned at the maximum rearward track to drive safely. This physical detail indicated that the offender drove each vehicle away from the original encounter point, repositioning the cars to buy time and delay discovery. This realization strongly supported the police impersonator hypothesis, explaining why every couple complied without initial signs of a physical fight inside the cabin. Investigators theorized that the killer used emergency dashboard lights, official-looking credentials, or a uniform to pull vehicles over along darkened roadways. Under the belief that they were interacting with legitimate law enforcement, the young couples naturally lowered their guard, allowing the predator to control them without drawing weapons or breaking glass. To test this theory, federal agents and state troopers conducted night patrol simulations along the pitch-black stretches of the parkway. Officers positioned test vehicles on secluded turnouts, shining high-beam headlights directly into the side mirrors of parked cars to blinding effect. The darkness outside the driver window was absolute, leaving occupants completely blind to who was approaching their vehicle until a knock sounded on the glass. The simulations demonstrated how easily an offender equipped with a flashlight and a convincing uniform could dominate 2 people in total darkness. The isolated, unlit nature of the state parkway created a total sensory void, where a driver could not see beyond the beam of light shining in their eyes. In that vulnerable moment, stepping out of their vehicle into the night, the victims lost all ability to defend themselves or run away. Crime scene technicians began a comprehensive recataloguing of physical trace evidence collected from all 4 crime scenes. They documented foreign hair fibers recovered from the trunk of Kathleen Thomas's car, along with microscopic red blanket fibers found on the remains of Anna Maria Phelps. They re-examined small .38 caliber bullet fragments pulled from the muddy soil at Ragged Island, alongside a discarded matchbook retrieved from Richard Call's dashboard. Each item was carefully recorded in evidence ledgers, but the lack of advanced forensic technology in the late 1980s severely restricted what analysis could be performed. Microscopic fiber matching could establish similarities, but it could not definitively prove a singular origin without a physical suspect to compare against. The physical evidence remained locked in storage, waiting for future analytical methods that did not yet exist. The investigation suffered tremendous damage from systemic evidence preservation errors committed during the late 1980s. Biological samples gathered at the scenes were frequently stored at ambient room temperatures inside standard cardboard boxes rather than climate-controlled environments. Over time, heat and humidity inside storage lockers degraded fragile biological material, destroying early opportunities for genetic testing before DNA profiling became standard practice. Furthermore, poor tracking procedures resulted in crucial biological swabs being misplaced as files were transferred back and forth between state laboratories and federal offices. Missing evidence logs and fragmented chains of custody left key physical items legally compromised or permanently lost. These fundamental failures in evidence preservation created severe roadblocks that would hamper cold case investigators for decades to come. To narrow the field, investigators turned to the FBI Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico for a detailed criminal profile. Analysts reviewed the patterns across the scenes and concluded that the offender was almost certainly a white male between 25 and 40 years old. He possessed an intimate familiarity with the regional back roads, held a background in military or law enforcement tactics, and likely had easy access to watercraft given the river disposal sites. The profile emphasized an individual who moved comfortably in isolated areas at night without drawing suspicion. His ability to exert absolute control over two victims simultaneously suggested training or professional authority. FBI profilers warned that this was not a reckless killer acting on impulse, but a methodical predator who calculated risk, selected controlled environments, and systematically minimized the evidence left behind. This profile pointed directly toward the dense cluster of military installations surrounding the Colonial Parkway corridor. Task Force detectives launched an exhaustive review of personnel at Naval Weapons Station Yorktown, Cheatham Annex, and Fort Eustis. Thousands of service members were cross-referenced against duty logs and leave records, but the sheer volume of personnel presented an overwhelming obstacle for investigators. Without a centralized national database for fingerprints or DNA at the time, matching individual military records against local evidence was painfully slow. Service members routinely transferred to new duty stations across the globe, leaving potential leads to go cold before interviews could even be scheduled. The vast, transient military population provided the ideal cover, allowing a killer to hide in plain sight among thousands of men in uniform. Investigators then turned their focus toward law enforcement agencies operating along the river corridor. They systematically vetted National Park Service rangers and local auxiliary sheriff deputies who had worked night traffic patrols between 1986 and 1989. Every officer with authorized access to emergency vehicle equipment and public safety credentials came under detailed scrutiny as detectives worked to identify any insider who abused his position. More than 80 active and former law enforcement officers were interviewed, subjected to background checks, and evaluated against shift records. Yet every verified officer eventually produced a solid alibi or was cleared by preliminary background checks. The wall of administrative alibis left investigators back at square one, unsure whether the killer was an actual officer or simply a civilian masterfully playing a role. As official leads stalled, the integrity of the investigation was further compromised by outside interference. A former deputy sheriff named Fred Atwell managed to insert himself into the heart of the case by posing as a private investigator. Atwell approached grieving families, offering promises of answers while actively gathering sensitive case details for his own purposes. Atwell collected money from victim families and eventually leaked graphic, confidential crime scene photos to outside parties, generating immense public confusion. His disruptive presence created years of investigative noise, forcing state police to spend vital time vetting his claims and managing leaks rather than pursuing legitimate leads. This circus-like distraction further fractured trust between the victims' families and official law enforcement. Beyond the chaos, forensic analysts continued to examine a chilling, persistent detail present across every crime scene: the intentional removal of the victim's footwear. Kathleen Thomas was found barefoot inside her vehicle, while Robin Edwards' shoes were carefully placed in the truck bed. Cassandra Haley's footwear remained in the abandoned Celica, and Anna Maria Phelps' shoes were completely missing from her remains. Pathologists recognized this pattern as a calculated psychological tactic designed to enforce absolute control. By stripping victims of their shoes, the killer severely restricted their ability to run or fight back in the harsh, overgrown terrain surrounding the scenes. This subtle signature demonstrated a chilling level of tactical foresight, ensuring that even if a victim broke free, escape into the dense woods was nearly impossible. By the early 1990s, emerging genetic science offered a brief ray of hope through early DNA testing methods known as restriction fragment length polymorphism. This primitive testing process required substantial amounts of fresh, undegraded biological material to generate an identifiable profile. State technicians gathered evidence from the rope used on Thomas and Dowski, along with the blanket recovered with Phelps, and submitted them for laboratory analysis. The results were a devastating blow to the investigation because the biological samples had suffered years of environmental exposure and improper room temperature storage. The available cellular material was severely degraded. The laboratory returned inconclusive findings, failing to yield a usable DNA profile. Early technologies simply could not bridge the gap left by proper evidence handling failures from years prior. By 1995, the overwhelming weight of dead ends and failed laboratory tests brought investigative momentum to a complete standstill. The multi-agency task force that had once operated with urgency was quietly dissolved as resources were reassigned to active cases. The massive case files were boxed up, sealed, and distributed to separate storage vaults across the state. The primary evidence sat divided between the FBI Norfolk Field Office, Virginia State Police Headquarters in Richmond, and the Isle of Wight Sheriff's Vault. Institutional silence replaced the once intense daily briefings, and the investigation slipped into a deep, frozen hibernation.
a killer remained at large, while the records of 8 stolen lives gathered dust in dark storage rooms. Along the Colonial Parkway, the physical landscapes where the crimes occurred began to reflect the quiet neglect of the unsolved cases. As winter settled over the peninsula in the late 1990s, the scenic overlooks grew overgrown with unchecked brush and tangled vines. Historical roadside markers faded under years of salt air, and the yellow police tape that had once cordoned off turnouts rotted into the soil. Local residents who had once pulled over to watch the river sunset now drove past without stopping, disturbed by the persistent darkness along the unlit roadway. The picturesque views of the York and James rivers felt heavy with an enduring sense of dread. The parkway was no longer seen as a place of leisure, but as a silent, winding graveyard, hiding unanswered secrets. In the years that followed, spatial analysts began reevaluating the geographic patterns of the crime locations with a fresh perspective. They mapped the precise coordinates of each scene relative to major waterways like the James River, the York River, and the Chesapeake Bay. Analysts realized that while investigators had focused heavily on highway transit routes, the geography strongly favored a predator operating on the water. Each body recovery site and abandoned vehicle location sat within a short distance of accessible boat launches and hidden docks. A killer, utilizing a small, motor-driven watercraft, could navigate between the isolated shorelines completely undetected by land patrols. This maritime access vector explained how an offender could move swiftly across multi-county jurisdictions without leaving tire tracks or triggering highway traffic stops. Behind the scenes, a critical administrative breakdown crippled the early momentum of the investigation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had recently established the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, a national database designed to cross-reference multi-jurisdictional homicides. However, local police departments and the Virginia State Police failed to input standardized crime scene data into the system during the critical early years of the slayings. Without synchronized entry of key indicators like vehicle locations, victim demographics, and specific knot ties, the national system could not register the emerging pattern. Important behavioral correlations between the Colonial Parkway double homicides and other regional unsolved crimes went completely unnoticed across federal borders. Information remained trapped inside filing cabinets in separate cities, leaving each agency blind to the full scale of the threat. This administrative stagnation took a startling turn in September 2009, when a severe security breach exposed the cold case files. Over 80 graphic, highly confidential crime scene photographs from the Colonial Parkway investigations suddenly surfaced on public internet forums. The leak shocked surviving family members and sent law enforcement officials into an immediate damage control crisis. An internal inquiry revealed that a former contractor for the Federal Bureau of Investigation had retained original glass plate negatives in personal home storage for decades. The contractor had taken the restricted files home upon retiring, storing priceless primary evidence in unsecure cardboard boxes. The scandal exposed a breathtaking lack of physical oversight regarding sensitive case files spanning more than 20 years. The public revelation of the leaked crime scene photos sparked overwhelming outrage among the victims' families, who demanded accountability for decades of official neglect. Relatives organized public demonstrations and pressured state legislators, arguing that federal and state agencies had treated the unsolved murders as forgotten footnotes. The overwhelming backlash left law enforcement with no choice but to confront their past mistakes directly.
In response to the mounting pressure, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Virginia State Police announced the creation of a joint cold case task force in 2010. Investigators ordered a comprehensive audit of every evidence locker and record repository across all involved jurisdictions. For the first time in 15 years, active detectives began recataloging physical items and preparing them for advanced forensic evaluation. Between 2010 and 2012, forensic scientists subjected preserved physical evidence to modern short tandem repeat testing techniques. Analysts carefully examined the nylon rope knots recovered from the 1986 scene of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. They also collected microscopic swabs from the interior door handles of David Nobling's truck and reanalyzed blanket fibers secured from the 1989 Daniel Lauer scene. Using advanced chemical extraction methods unavailable in the 1980s, technicians managed to isolate minute cellular deposits buried deep within the rope fibers and vehicle upholstery. These techniques allowed analysts to separate background environmental contaminants from usable human biological matter. The careful retesting promised to unlock cellular secrets that had remained hidden for over a quarter of a century. The lab work paid off when geneticists successfully extracted partial male biological profiles from key items collected at the Ragged Island scene. While incomplete, the genetic markers were sufficient to run comparison checks across state and federal offender registries. Forensic analysts uploaded the resulting profiles into the combined DNA index system to search for potential matches among known violent criminals. Despite high expectations, the national automated system returned 0 hits across all state and federal felon databases. The absence of a match meant the unknown contributor had never been convicted of a qualifying felony that required mandatory genetic sampling. The investigation hit another agonizing standstill, proving that standard forensic tools were limited without a pre-existing profile in the system. As the decade drew to a close, investigators realized that traditional criminal databases would never solve the Colonial Parkway murders. A fundamental shift was taking place in forensic science, moving beyond passive database matching toward proactive genetic mapping. Law enforcement would have to wait for emerging technologies to turn distant biological hints into concrete identities. That breakthrough arrived in the early 2020s with the rise of investigative genetic genealogy. By utilizing single nucleotide polymorphism array processing, scientists could extract tens of thousands of genetic markers from degraded trace samples. This revolutionary approach allowed investigators to search beyond criminal databases and enter the vast world of consumer genetic ancestry databases. In a pivotal step forward, cold case detectives sent preserved biological samples from the 1987 Ragged Island crime scene to specialized private laboratories. Companies like Othram Incorporated and Bodhi Technology applied advanced extraction protocols to retrieve usable genetic data from degraded tissue samples. The goal was to build a comprehensive genomic profile capable of tracing family lineages across multiple generations. Lab technicians worked meticulously to reconstruct the degraded genetic sequence of the unknown male contributor recovered from Robin Edwards and David Nobling. Once the high-density genomic profile was built, specialized genealogists uploaded the raw digital data into public genealogy databases like GED Match and Family Tree DNA, they immediately began searching for shared DNA segments among millions of registered users. Genetic genealogists began constructing sprawling family trees based on distant genetic overlaps, identifying third and fourth cousins of the unknown suspect. By cross-referencing public census records, birth certificates, and historical obituaries, researchers traced these scattered living relatives back to a common set of great-great-grandparents. The genetic trail pointed directly to a long-established family lineage in eastern Virginia. This genetic mapping process transformed the investigation from a hopeless search for a single ghost into a structured mathematical reduction. Genealogists mapped out every branch of the ancestral tree, systematically eliminating female lines and individuals who lived outside the region. The process narrowed hundreds of possible descendants down to a specific branch of male relatives active during the late 1980s. Detectives then began auditing the historical records of the narrowed family tree to find specific individuals who fit the established geographic and physical parameters. Investigators searched land deeds, vehicle registrations, and employment records across the Hampton Roads and Lancaster County areas for the years 1986 through 1989. They looked specifically for men who possessed maritime experience and operated heavy work vehicles. Analysts focused on male relatives who owned small watercraft, lived near the major rivers, and worked in industries providing flexible, unsupervised night hours. Each candidate was measured against the physical description provided by historical witnesses and the behavioral profile developed decades earlier. The vast field of potential suspects was rapidly shrinking down to a single, haunting possibility. The genealogical investigation eventually produced a single name from the dense tangle of ancestral records. That name was Allen Wade Wilmer Sr., a deceased local commercial fisherman and tree trimmer who lived in the region during the height of the killings. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, investigators had a concrete individual rather than a shadowy composite profile. The emergence of this specific target transformed the entire landscape of the cold case. Detective files that had sat dormant for years were suddenly reopened with a singular focus on one man's historical footprint. What was once an open-ended search across thousands of potential leads had narrowed to a definitive personal record embedded in the local waterways. During the late 1980s, Wilmer Sr. maintained an existence deeply tied to the isolated waters of eastern Virginia. He spent extended periods living aboard his commercial fishing boat, navigating the dark channels of the James and York rivers. His daily routine revolved around the secluded docks, tidal creeks, and quiet stretches of coastline where land met water. On land, he drove a distinctive blue 1982 Dodge Ram pickup truck featuring a custom license plate that read Denny. The vehicle was a familiar sight along the rural access roads and timberlines bordering the water. It possessed the rugged utility required for hauling heavy equipment, moving through overgrown access lanes, and operating without drawing unnecessary attention in remote areas. Wilmer Sr. had died in 2017 at the age of 63 in his Lancaster County home, long before genetic genealogy pointed to his doorstep. Because he was deceased, investigators could not execute a standard search warrant to obtain a direct buccal swab. Instead, detectives moved discreetly to recover preserved biological artifacts and request access to retained medical examiner samples from past medical files. Forensic technicians isolated genetic material from these secured items and submitted the sample for high-density STR profile generation. The laboratory extracted a clean male profile and prepared it for direct comparison against the evidence preserved in cold storage. Every step required rigorous chain of custody documentation to ensure the resulting scientific findings would withstand legal scrutiny. The laboratory comparison produced a definitive match between the genetic material of Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. and the biological evidence recovered from the 1987 Ragged Island double homicide. The statistical probability was staggering, establishing a match ratio exceeding 1 in several billion. The physical evidence left on David Knobling and Robin Edwards was definitively tied to a single man. This forensic milestone shattered 37 years of cold silence with indisputable biological certainty. The genetic data demonstrated that the perpetrator was not a floating phantom, but a specific resident who had walked the same riverbanks as his victims. Decades of speculation regarding anonymous transient killers were replaced by verified laboratory metrics. On January 8, 2024, the Virginia State Police and the FBI held a joint press conference to announce the major breakthrough. Officials formally identified Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. as the individual responsible for the murders of David Knobling and Robin Edwards. The announcement provided the first tangible answer to families who had waited decades for accountability. For the surviving relatives, the public identification brought a complex mix of profound relief and painful reality. While the revelation confirmed that the killer was no longer walking free, it also opened a new chapter of questioning regarding how he had operated undetected for so long. The lingering silence of 37 years was finally broken by an official record. The forensic testing yielded an additional breakthrough that extended beyond the traditional scope of the Colonial Parkway case file. The exact same DNA profile extracted from Wilmer Sr. matched biological evidence recovered from the 1989 murder of Teresa Lynn Howell. Howell had been strangled and left in a wooded area in Hampton after leaving a local nightclub. Her murder had long been classified as an isolated local crime, completely unlinked to the double homicides along the Parkway. The genetic match proved that Wilmer Sr.'s violent footprint extended beyond secluded lovers' lanes into urban night spots. It demonstrated a wider pattern of predatory behavior that crossed jurisdictional lines without attracting investigative overlap. The primary reason Wilmer Sr. managed to evade law enforcement scrutiny during his lifetime was his complete absence from violent crime databases. He maintained 0 felony conviction records across his entire adult life. Because he was never arrested for a violent offense, his biological profile was never entered into state or federal DNA registries. His legal history consisted only of minor traffic citations, keeping him entirely under the institutional radar. Furthermore, his independent work as a commercial fisherman and self-employed tree trimmer meant he operated without corporate oversight or fixed schedule constraints. He moved freely across the region during nighttime hours without exciting suspicion or generating workplace records. The positive identification of Wilmer Sr. forced law enforcement to confront a fundamental question about their historical strategy. To understand how a multi-jurisdictional predator operated in plain sight for decades, investigators had to re-examine the core assumptions that guided the original task force. The path to answers required dissecting the missteps that derailed early efforts. For nearly 40 years, the investigation suffered from a critical analytical trap known as the police impersonator hypothesis. Federal and state agencies became hyper-focused on the belief that the killer was an active or former law enforcement officer, security guard, or park ranger. Thousands of investigative hours were spent vetting uniform badges, vehicle spotlights, and official equipment. This institutional tunnel vision caused detectives to overlook local outdoorsmen and commercial river workers who possessed intimate geographic knowledge of the waterways. While law enforcement looked for suspect vehicles with emergency lights, a local fisherman with access to private boats and work trucks moved through the exact same territory without attracting suspicion. Commercial watermen like Wilmer Sr. possessed a unique tactical advantage across the marshlands and tidal basins of eastern Virginia. They knew every unlit dock, hidden creek bed, and private boat ramp along the James and York rivers. He did not require official authority or flashing lights to control his environment. He relied on total familiarity with dark, unmonitored terrain. Commercial watermen like Allen Wilmer Sr. operated within a maritime landscape where lines between land and river blurred. He knew every unlit dock, hidden creek bed, and private boat ramp stretching across the James River and York River. He did not require an official police cruiser or emergency lights to corner a target. He relied on natural cover, thick night shadows, and complete familiarity with isolated terrain that law enforcement officers found unnavigable. Reconstructing the night of September 19, 1987, reveals how easily this local geographic knowledge could be weaponized. David Knobling and Robin Edwards were parked near the edge of Ragged Island Wildlife Management Area, a desolate reach of marshland bathed in damp, heavy river mist. The tall marsh grass swayed in the cold wind, muffling the sound of footsteps arriving from the darkness. Wilmer did not approach as a state trooper or park ranger with a flashing spotlight. He moved across the familiar mud and gravel as a local waterman who belonged in those woods, perhaps offering help or confronting them for trespassing on marshland he frequented. By the time a weapon was drawn, the element of surprise was total, trapping the young couple in an inescapable pitch-black sanctuary. A re-examination of early physical evidence further connects his daily routine to the crime scenes. Investigators working the 1986 murder of Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski noted the presence of diesel fuel residue on clothing and rope bindings. Wilmer ran a local tree trimming service and operated heavy diesel engines on his commercial fishing vessel, two occupations that required constant handling of diesel fuel, heavy rigging ropes, and specialized nautical knots. These distinct occupational markers, matching precisely with the forensic record, went overlooked for decades because investigators analyzed each piece of physical evidence in isolation. The heavy ropes used to secure victims and the chemical traces left on their garments were not exotic military supplies, but everyday tools of a blue-collar worker operating routinely in local tree trimming yards and harbor slips. The true shield protecting Wilmer was not a masterfully constructed alibi, but the rigid jurisdictional silos dividing local and state authorities. Ragged Island fell under the jurisdiction of the Isle of Wight County Sheriff's Office, while the Parkway killings belonged to the FBI and National Park Service. Meanwhile, adjacent homicides in Toano and Hampton were handled by separate municipal and county police departments. These institutional silos prevented agencies from cross-referencing local field interviews, traffic stops, or suspicious person reports across county lines. A suspicious vehicle or known local waterman flagged in one district never triggered an alert in another. Wilmer moved freely across these artificial boundaries, protected by the very bureaucratic friction that hindered the joint pursuit of justice.
Today, cold case investigators with the Virginia State Police and the FBI are systematically comparing Wilmer's complete genetic profile against remaining biological evidence from the unsolved double homicides. Preserved evidence from the scenes involving Kathleen Thomas, Rebecca Dowski, Richard Call, Cassandra Haley, Daniel Lauer, and Anna Maria Phelps is undergoing advanced laboratory processing to determine if his DNA links him directly to all 4 original crime sites. Advanced forensic extraction techniques capable of isolating degraded genetic samples that failed standard testing in earlier decades are currently being applied to every preserved slide, hair, and fiber. State crime labs are running these newly extracted profiles through national databases to verify whether Wilmer's physical presence extends to other unresolved violent crimes across the mid-Atlantic region. For the families of Richard Call and Cassandra Haley, who vanished in 1988, leaving only a vacant vehicle along the parkway, these forensic revelations bring a chilling new realization.
If Wilmer utilized his commercial fishing boat on the night of their disappearance, the physical evidence of their fate may have been taken out into the deep water channels of the York River. This potential maritime disposal explains why decades of exhaustive ground searches, canine sweeps, and forest grids yielded no physical remains. The vast tidal expanse of the Chesapeake Bay watershed became a silent vault, hiding the evidence of a double homicide that land-based search teams could never hope to uncover. The tragedy of this breakthrough is compounded by the relentless passage of time. Alan Wilmer Sr. died quietly in December 2017 at the age of 63, living out his final years as a free man in Lancaster County without ever facing a courtroom, an interrogation room, or physical handcuffs. For the surviving parents, siblings, and loved ones who spent nearly 40 years enduring agonizing uncertainty, justice arrives not as a guilty verdict or a prison sentence, but as a cold forensic label. The closure offered by modern DNA science cannot replace 4 decades of stolen life, nor can it grant the families their day in court. Reevaluating early witness statements from the late 1980s reveals that physical descriptions of suspicious men observed near Parkway overlooks were remarkably consistent. Witnesses repeatedly reported a stocky man between 5 feet 9 inches and 6 feet tall, with a full beard and wearing heavy flannel or hunting gear. This physical profile matched Wilmer's exact appearance during his 30s, when he frequented local hunting spots and waterfront docks. Yet because early investigative theories prioritized a neatly uniformed police officer or security guard, these witness statements describing a rugged local outdoorsman were filed away as low-priority tips. The structural failures of the Colonial Parkway investigation ultimately forced a fundamental revolution in how multi-jurisdictional serial cases are handled. The catastrophic breakdown in communication between federal, state, and local agencies became a classic case study in how institutional rivalry enables a serial predator to operate undetected across municipal borders. In response to these systemic flaws, law enforcement agencies modernized their task force protocols, establishing mandatory real-time evidence sharing and centralized intelligence databases. The painful lessons learned along the Parkway reshaped homicide response guidelines across the country, ensuring that jurisdictional walls no longer protect violent offenders. Today, the quiet waterways of the Chesapeake Bay watershed flow much as they did 4 decades ago. At dawn, commercial fishing boats still push out through the morning mist, their engines humming against the tide. The landscape remains serene, but beneath the quiet beauty of the marshes lies the haunting memory of a predator who once used these same dark waters to slip away into history. Understanding how Alan Wilmer Sr. operated requires examining his daily routine along the Virginia coastline. As a commercial waterman, his livelihood revolved around the seasonal rhythms of the water, operating small craft without traditional schedules or rigid geographic boundaries. This professional flexibility allowed him to move across isolated riverbanks and coastal backroads at all hours without raising suspicion from law enforcement or local residents. The quiet inlets of the Chesapeake Bay watershed provided the ideal backdrop for a hidden predator. Early in the morning, long before sunrise, commercial fishermen routinely launched their vessels into the fog, their heavy boots stepping quietly across wooden docks. In these damp tidal marshlands, a boat engine idling in the darkness was an ordinary sound, easily lost in the ambient rustle of marsh grass and rising tide. Following the 2024 DNA breakthrough, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Virginia State Police launched a targeted public appeal. Investigators urgently sought information from former deckhands, commercial fishing associates, and personal acquaintances who remembered Alan Wilmer Sr. between 1986 and 1990. Authorities focused specifically on his distinct blue Dodge Ram pickup truck and two commercial fishing vessels named Fair Winds and Denny. Detectives established dedicated hotlines asking anyone who worked alongside Wilmer on the water or traveled with him during those years to come forward. Investigators systematically compiled lists of his known hunting spots, boat slips, and tree trimming job sites across the region. Every tip offered another potential link in establishing his exact movements during the years when young couples were disappearing along the Parkway. The revelation of Wilmer's identity triggered a massive retrospective audit across the Mid-Atlantic region. Forensic teams and cold case investigators began re-examining unsolved missing person files and unlinked homicides in Virginia and North Carolina, spanning from 1980 through 2010. Authorities faced the grim possibility that Wilmer was not merely an opportunistic killer in the late 1980s, but an active serial predator who hunted undetected for decades. Forensic reconstruction of the crime scenes reveals how a single armed offender managed to subdue two victims simultaneously without suffering physical injury. The attacker relied on immediate, overwhelming force, brandishing a firearm at point-blank range to instill total psychological paralysis. By establishing immediate dominance, he forced the victims into a state of acute compliance, removing any chance of coordinated physical resistance. Once control was established in a secluded lover's lane, the offender systematically bound the male victim first, neutralizing the primary physical threat. The remote geographic settings provided time and cover, eliminating the risk of sudden interruption by passing motorists or park rangers. This deliberate sequence allowed a single predator to maintain complete control over multiple victims in isolated environments. The resolution of these cold cases highlights the critical role played by modern investigative genetic genealogy. Traditional forensic testing often failed when dealing with heavily degraded or low-quantity biological samples recovered from decades-old evidence. Modern laboratory protocols bypass these historical limitations by extracting single nucleotide polymorphism profiles, building complex genetic data sets from microgram quantities of original biological material. This technological leap allowed forensic genealogists to construct vast family trees, tracing distant biological relationships back to a single common ancestor. By cross-referencing public genealogy databases with crime scene evidence, Cold case units unlocked investigations that had been completely frozen for over 35 years. This methodology has revolutionized cold case work across the globe, ensuring that ancient evidence can still deliver definitive identification. The physical identification of Alan Wilmer Sr. answered decades of forensic questions, but it also cast a long, somber shadow across Virginia's dark corridors. The transition from active investigation to historical reflection brings into sharp focus the systemic fractures that allowed these crimes to remain unresolved for nearly 4 decades. What began as a series of unexplained disappearances along scenic highways became a stark lesson in institutional vulnerability. As the forensic timeline settles into historical record, the focus shifts from the mechanics of the crimes to the enduring impact left in their wake. Decades of investigative misdirection and lost evidence created a trail of profound consequences for the families left behind. The physical evidence preserved in evidence lockers finally provided answers, but it could not undo the immense human toll exacted over 38 years. For 38 years, the human cost of the Colonial Parkway murders was borne by grieving families trapped in painful uncertainty. Parents like Bill Thomas and Joyce Call spent decades publicly demanding accountability, pushing reluctant law enforcement bureaucracies to keep searching for answers. They spent their lives organizing rallies, confronting investigators, and refusing to let their children's names be forgotten in dusty archives. Tragically, many of the parents passed away long before learning the identity of the man who tore their families apart. They spent their final days without closure, haunted by unanswered questions about their children's final moments. Their relentless pursuit of truth highlighted the agonizing weight carried by families who must fight both the trauma of violent loss and the inertia of official inaction. Along the quiet riverbanks where these young lives were abruptly taken, the water continues its silent motion toward the bay. The physical locations remain largely unchanged, marked only by the rustle of pine needles and the cold wind drifting off the York River. The natural landscape carries no visible scars of the violent encounters that took place decades ago beneath its dark canopy. Today, motorists travel along the Colonial Parkway, their tires humming smoothly against the historic laid brick road surface. Visitors flock to nearby Yorktown battlefield, strolling through sunlit fields and historic monuments under a dense forest canopy. The vast majority of travelers pass through the park oblivious to the grim history embedded in the surrounding soil and secluded pull-offs. Beneath the picturesque surface of the national park lies a complex forensic record preserved in court files and evidence boxes. Park rangers continue their routine patrols along the cobblestone highway, passing the very turnouts where cars were once discovered idling empty in the darkness. The scenic corridor stands as both a popular tourist destination and an enduring crime scene etched into regional history. A clinical audit of the Colonial Parkway investigation exposes a series of critical institutional failures that severely crippled early progress. Territorial friction between federal, state, and local agencies created immediate communication barriers, preventing the timely centralization of physical evidence and witness reports. Key investigative teams operated in isolated silos, failing to share vital intelligence that might have linked the cases much sooner. This systemic paralysis was further compounded by severe tunnel vision, as investigators focused obsessively on the police impersonator theory to the exclusion of other viable leads. Critical evidence was misclassified, potential witness descriptions were dismissed, and crucial physical leads were lost in administrative handoffs. The failure to establish a unified investigative strategy during the crucial early years allowed a dangerous predator to walk free for the rest of his natural life. Amid the systemic breakdowns that defined the early investigation, one quiet success kept the possibility of justice alive across 4 decades. Property clerks in local police departments and state crime laboratories carefully maintained the physical evidence, securing biological samples in temperature-controlled storage long after active leads went cold. Their strict adherence to chain of custody preserved microscopic DNA material that initial testing methods could never extract. Because those forensic items remained undisturbed in evidence lockers, analysts in 2024 possess viable biological profiles capable of advanced genetic sequencing. Without that relentless administrative care, modern investigative genetic genealogy would have yielded nothing. The dedication of line-level evidence custodians ultimately created the single bridge between a forgotten cold case file and a definitive forensic match. Yet the identification of Alan Wilmer Sr. does not bring a clean conclusion to every file linked to the Colonial Parkway murders between 1986 and 1989. While DNA evidence definitively bound him to the homicides of David Knobling, Robin Edwards, and Teresa Lynn Howell, state investigators face unanswered questions regarding the remaining cases. Forensics laboratories continue to process archived material to determine if Wilmer acted alone or if another predator walked those same corridors. The possibility that multiple killers operated along the parkway during the same era remains a sobering reality for the Virginia State Police and FBI team. If certain crime scenes reflect different signatures, the closing of one file does not automatically resolve the rest. Until every scrap of preserved evidence undergoes testing, the full scope of what transpired along the water remains open to scrutiny. Behind every police file, map, and biological sample lies the heavy weight of 8 stolen lives. Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski were bright university students with promising futures before their car was found off the Parkway in 1986. David Knobling and Robin Edwards had their lives cut short at Ragged Island, leaving families to navigate decades of grief. Richard Call and Cassandra Haley vanished into the night, leaving behind an empty car and unanswered questions that haunted their parents for decades. Daniel Lauer and Anna Maria Phelps were heading toward a new chapter when their journey ended in the woods near Huntersville. Remembering these 8 individuals restores humanity to an investigation too often defined solely by its failures. The resolution of long unsolved homicides rarely follows the dramatic arc of a sudden courtroom confession. Instead, cold cases are methodically dismantled through incremental advances in laboratory technology, public record indexing, and genealogical mapping. A single microscopic sample dormant for 30 years can quietly override decades of investigative false starts. This forensic progression demonstrates how scientific persistence eventually circumvents human error and departmental barriers. When traditional interviews and physical surveillance hit dead ends, genetic data provides an objective, unalterable record of presence. The dismantling of the Colonial Parkway silence relied not on a single breakthrough moment, but on decades of patient scientific evolution. As dusk falls over the shoreline of Ragged Island, gray waters move quietly against the marsh grass beneath the James River Bridge. The wind pulls across the open mudflats, carrying the same thick silence that masked a predator's movements during the late 1980s. The landscape remains largely unchanged, holding its secrets beneath shifting tides and dark tree lines. The structural mistakes of the original investigation prompted sweeping reforms across federal and state law enforcement agencies in Virginia. Interagency protocols now mandate centralized crime scene management and immediate evidence sharing during multi-jurisdictional violent crime investigations, Forensic tracking databases ensure that physical material collected at rural crime scenes is automatically cross-referenced across county lines. State crime laboratories also established mandatory long-term preservation protocols for all unassigned biological evidence from unsolved homicides. Evidence property rooms are now audited under strict national standards to prevent sample degradation over extended periods. These policy changes ensure that future cold cases retain the molecular integrity required for emerging scientific techniques. For the families of the victims, news of a forensic match brings a complex mixture of relief and renewed pain. Answers provided 38 years later cannot replace missed milestones, family gatherings, or the presence of loved ones lost in their youth. Many parents passed away before learning the truth, leaving surviving siblings and children to bear the emotional burden of these long-delayed answers. The regional community along the Chesapeake Bay carries a permanent scar left by years of fear and uncertainty. Generations of residents grew up aware of the dark reputation attached to the secluded turnouts along the scenic highway. The resolution of individual cases brings a measure of clarity, but the historical trauma embedded in the local culture endures. The Colonial Parkway case stands as a landmark study in how jurisdictional rivalries and early investigative biases can inadvertently shield a violent offender. The historical record from 1986 through 1989 shows how assumptions regarding suspect profiles limited the scope of inquiry. Modern investigative training modules now use these specific failures to teach detectives how to identify and dismantle tunnel vision early in an inquiry. By integrating investigative genetic genealogy with traditional police work, modern task forces have reshaped how long-standing cold cases are audited. The transition from physical leads to genomic mapping shifted the fundamental approach of cold case units nationwide. What was once considered an unsolvable file can now be re-examined with mathematical precision. Along the quiet stretches of the Parkway, where trees frame the dark waters of the York River, lingering questions remain suspended in the air. The physical evidence has yielded crucial answers, but no record can fully reconstruct the precise moments that unfolded inside those parked vehicles. The silent stretches of road preserve an unwritten history that science can only partially reveal. The darkness along the highway conceals details that vanished with the passage of time and the death of the suspect. While laboratory charts align dates and genetic markers, the exact sequence of events during those tragic nights remains shrouded in shadow. The terrain holds its quiet and enduring witness to moments that forever changed 8 families. The ongoing work of state analysts and forensic genealogists ensures that the remaining evidence files stay under active review. Modern cold case protocols mandate that every untested item from the original crime scenes undergo advanced extraction as technology improves. The legal and scientific record of the Colonial Parkway investigation remains open, driven by an unyielding requirement to pursue complete factual accountability. The systemic breakdown across jurisdictional lines forced structural reform in multi-agency task forces throughout Virginia. State police and federal investigators eventually established shared evidence vaults and unified digital record systems, ensuring that critical intelligence gathered in 1986 or 1989 would never again sit isolated inside separate departmental filing cabinets. For the families of the victims, 4 decades of silence left deep wounds that procedural shifts could never mend. Parents spent their remaining years waiting by silent telephones, watching empty doorways, and seeking answers about Richard Call, Kathleen Thomas, and the others, receiving closure far too late to bring them comfort. Siblings and surviving loved ones carried the quiet burden of unresolved grief into their own adult lives. Their personal memories remained permanently tethered to the unfinished stories of young adults who simply went out for an evening drive along the Colonial Parkway and vanished into the dark shadows of the Virginia coastline. The early investigative failures along the highway fundamentally transformed public perception of safety across quiet, rural communities. A once trusted scenic bypass became a permanent symbol of sudden danger, proving that institutional delays and fragmented communication can allow a dangerous predator to operate unseen in plain sight for years. This tragedy fundamentally altered how law enforcement agencies approach potential serial crimes across county lines and state borders. The painful realization that unlinked evidence cost valuable years pushed national criminal justice standards toward mandatory, immediate cross-agency sharing whenever pattern homicides are suspected in neighboring jurisdictions. Yet, key technical questions remain beyond the reach of complete scientific verification. Forensic analysts cannot conclusively prove whether every single crime scene along the Parkway was linked to one individual mind, or if separate opportunists took advantage of the dark, isolated pull-offs during those same uncertain years. The complete absence of surviving physical evidence from certain early scenes leaves lingering gaps that modern genetic testing cannot bridge. Where degraded clothing or compromised crime scenes offer no workable DNA profiles, the official investigative record must rely on circumstantial connections that leave room for ongoing debate. Today, the narrow asphalt of the Colonial Parkway stretches quietly past dense forests and tidal waters under the open blue sky. Sunlight filters through the high overhead tree canopy, casting soft shadows across the paved turnouts where young college students once pulled off to watch the river at dusk. The York River sweeps steadily along the shoreline, forever washing away the physical traces of that dark era. The surrounding natural landscape has fully reclaimed the quiet pull-offs, leaving only yellowed police transcripts, court filings, and official case folders to document the tragedy that transpired along the bank. Cold case units continue to carefully re-examine old evidence boxes, running surviving physical samples through updated genetic database software as new technology emerges. Every preserved item, from carpet fibers to microscopic trace materials, remains secured inside temperature-controlled state crime archives, awaiting future analytical breakthroughs. State police detectives regularly review the long history of the investigation alongside modern forensic pathologists, ensuring that fresh eyes reevaluate every surviving lab report. They maintain an unyielding protocol of testing previously unviable samples whenever refined DNA extraction and advanced mapping methods become available to law enforcement. The long pursuit of truth along the Virginia Peninsula stands as a solemn reminder of human resilience in the face of early institutional error. It demonstrates that while justice was delayed by missed connections and siloed authorities, the enduring commitment to facts outlasts generations of original investigators. The historical lessons drawn from these tragic cold cases continue to directly shape modern investigative training across the nation. The procedural errors made during the late 1980s now serve as critical case studies for federal agents learning how to overcome departmental pride and share evidence rapidly during active manhunts. A single stone marker stands quietly near the edge of the water, anchored deep in the riverbank soil, bearing permanent witness to the 8 lives lost along the Colonial Parkway.